before he steps down as Prime Minister, one of his last acts is to actually get the British Chiefs of Staff to come up with a plan for a limited war between Britain and the Soviet Union in Europe. The way Stalin handles Churchill at this meeting, I think, is very interesting. If we're serious about solving the problems that we face today, then we need to be able to sort of to focus and mobilise in the way that he did to do that. Throughout his whole life, even after the Second World War, Churchill is still pursuing, to some extent, the approval of his father.
If you had the opportunity to sit down with Churchill, what do you think you'd want to know in retrospect? What would you want to ask him?
Now, that's a really interesting question, and quite a difficult one to answer in a lot of ways.
The following is a conversation with Alan Packwood, one of the foremost global experts on Sir Winston Churchill. Alan has been the director of the Churchill Archives Centre based in Cambridge for over 20 years, which houses the private and personal papers of Sir Winston Churchill. In 2016, Alan received an OBE in the Queen's Birthdays Honours List for his services to archives and scholarship. He's authored multiple books, including How Churchill Waged War and, released earlier this year, Letters for the Ages, the personal and private correspondence of Sir Winston Churchill. Alan is a fountain of knowledge. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for quite a while now, and I really hope that this conversation gives you an insight into the human side behind Churchill, his strategy, and how shrewd he was as a politician. Above all, I hope you enjoy it. As you're aware, more books have probably been written about Winston Churchill than any leader, probably since Napoleon. Mm-hmm. What was your impression when you first became director of the Archive Centre, and what have you learnt about Churchill personally, about his life, that has taken its toll on you or affected your life since then?
Mm. Well, that's a fantastic question, and one that we could spend a whole hour answering in itself. I first came to the Churchill Archives Centre in September 1995, 28 years ago, almost to the week. And I was a young, naive, green archivist. I didn't really know that much about Churchill, to be honest. I'd done a general degree in history at Nottingham University. I'd done some courses in modern history, but my main interests had been medieval. I trained as an archivist, and it was the job that brought me to Cambridge. I was one of a team of five archivists brought in to catalogue Churchill's papers just after they'd been acquired for the nation with Heritage Lottery funding. So 2,500 boxes, about 1 million items, and we had 5 years to go through it and catalogue it and exhibit it. So in the course of that 5-year period, I learnt an enormous amount. You're literally in the archive seeing Churchill on a day-by-day basis. You're seeing all of the letters and telegrams that he's receiving and the replies that he's sending out. You're seeing the drafts for his newspaper articles and speeches. So I suppose my apprenticeship on Churchill was those first 5 years, and really being immersed in his papers, in his collection. And then at the end of that period, I was lucky enough to go on to remain with the Archive Centre and to ultimately become director of the centre in 2002. In terms of what I've learned about Churchill, I think the answer to that is I am still always learning. I mean, it's such an amazing life, really. I mean, first of all, it's an incredibly long life, one that starts in the Victorian era and comes right up into the atomic age. And because Churchill was born into the high British aristocracy, because he enters Parliament at such a young age, because he holds cabinet office from such a young age, he's in correspondence with everybody and on a huge range of subjects. So the collection contains correspondence with politicians, as you would expect from across the political spectrum. So you've got Baldwin, Chamberlain, Ramsay MacDonald, they're all there. But you've also got correspondence with cultural figures. So writers like George Bernard Shaw or Lawrence of Arabia. You've got Vivian Leigh, Laurence Olivier, Charlie Chaplin. So he has this incredible social and cultural network. And the great thing about Churchill, I think, is that he's not just a participant in events. He also sets out quite deliberately from the very beginning to also be an historian and a chronicler of those events. So his whole career is underpinned by his own writings, and he uses those to fund his political career, but he also uses them to raise his profile, to advance his ideas. So you've got someone who is simultaneously both an actor in events and someone who is sort of interpreting those events for the benefit of himself in the present, but also with an eye to his legacy and to posterity. You know, here's someone who writes or publishes 40 books in 70 volumes in his lifetime, and of course wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, as well as becoming wartime Prime Minister 1940 to 45 and Prime Minister again in the 1950s. So for me, a lot of the fascination lies in the juxtaposition between what actually happened and how he chooses to present and interpret what happened.
I mean, when you think about Churchill, I struggle to find another historical leader who's had such a storied life and lived through so many momentous periods of history. The First World War, the Second World War, and really the beginning of the Cold War as well. And he's seen so much. He saw the country essentially change before his eyes as well. But one thing I've sort of always been fascinated with is this sense of Churchill seeing himself as being with destiny. You know, there's that quote, isn't there? I think he says, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny" when he becomes Prime Minister, and as if every year of his life has been leading up to this moment. Equally, I think he says in a letter in 1897 that I have faith in my star. Where does this come from, this sense inside him that he's walking with destiny, that he is a man of destiny and he's meant to do great things in the world? Where was that born?
It's a really interesting question. And I sort of feel that part of it comes from actually quite a lonely childhood. Here is someone who is the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, prominent Conservative politician, when Churchill is young, a rising star in the Conservative firmament, and his mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, who is a society hostess, a networker. I mean, they're very much the A-list couple of their day. But of course, that means that they don't have an enormous amount of time for their children. And Churchill only has one brother, and he's much younger. And it means, I think, that as a young boy, he spends quite a lot of time on his own and sort of forced back on his own resources. And he spends that time, of course, in places like Blenheim Palace, the home of his grandfather, the Duke of Marlborough. That's where he's spending his summer. And there he's surrounded by imagery of this great political and military past, going back to his ancestor, the sort of first Duke of Marlborough. He can't escape it. It's everywhere. It's on the walls, in the portraits and the tapestries. So he's acutely aware that he's perhaps not quite like other children, that he is born into this great tradition. And I think he doesn't have very many friends. When he goes to school, there aren't that many other individuals that he's close to. I think he becomes quite a stubborn, willful, rebellious child. And I think his sense of sort of self-importance, his sense of destiny, is therefore sort of formed and forged very early on. And I think then a further catalyst to this is the early death of his father in 1895. Lord Randolph Churchill dies when Churchill is only 20 years old. He hasn't yet had a chance to prove himself to his father. In fact, all the indications from the correspondence that survives are that his father actually had a fairly poor regard for his abilities. He hadn't done particularly well at school. Again, for the reason that I've just given, really, where his reason, interest or imagination were not engaged, he wrote that he would not or he could not learn. He refused to fall in with school ways. Consequently, he doesn't do particularly well academically. He's not felt clever enough to go to university or to go into the law, and so he's dispatched off into the Victorian army. And his father dies at this point, just as he's joining the army, and suddenly he becomes head of his branch of the family. And I think his father's death is a double-edged sword for him. On the one hand, his father has died before he's had a chance to prove himself to his father. And that's something that really, I think, upsets him, but also drives him, because he's determined to prove himself to his father's ghost. And he makes the decision very quickly after his father's death that he's not going to remain in the army, that he's going to go into politics, that he's going to take up his father's mantle, that he's going to take up his father's causes. And I think as a young man, you can see that he's driven by this to sort of finish the work that his father has started to prove himself to the absent father. But of course, his father's death is also an opportunity in that respect, because had Lord Randolph lived, it would have been much harder, I think, for Churchill to have come out of his shadow and to forged his own path. So it's that combination of being the son of famous parents and a member of the aristocracy, with the early death of the parent and the need to prove himself, and the need, because he's a younger son and therefore not going to inherit the title, the need to earn money and make a name for himself.
Yes, I mean, I was going to actually say how I think that it was a massive motivating factor from what I've read, his father. Clearly, he didn't get that much love from his father when he was a child, and I always thought perhaps he felt like he was living in his shadow, and perhaps the early death of his father was something that propelled him to new heights. Do you think that there was I don't know the ins and outs of what happened to his father, but I do know he was a rising star within the Conservative Party. Do you think maybe he felt like he was carrying on the mantle from his father, or because many people did see him as a future prime minister, his father, didn't they? So maybe he thought, I can follow in his footsteps. Is there something there?
I think there is something in that, but there is something in his father's dramatic fall. So Lord Randolph Churchill is a really interesting character. He is a great speaker, an orator. He's sort of famous for his cutting wit, so you can see that Churchill may well have inherited from some of that. And he makes his name, really, as quite a mischievous presence in the House of Commons. He's someone who spends as much time attacking his own benches as attacking the opposition. So he's a famous figure. He's very distinctive. He has a very distinctive moustache, which then gets reproduced in contemporary cartoons and on matchbox cards and things in his day. So he's a famous figure, and Churchill is actually able to earn a little bit of extra pocket money at school by selling his father's autograph, or by trying to sell his father's autograph. So Churchill clearly sort of is aware of his father as a famous figure, idolises his father. And then I think when the problem is that his father throws it all away very spectacularly. He becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then makes a sudden resignation when he thinks that his budget is being challenged, particularly over military expenditure. Very impetuous resignation. And he expects the Prime Minister not to accept this resignation. But the Prime Minister chooses the other course that's open to him. He accepts it. And that effectively is the end of Lord Randolph Churchill's political career. He never holds high office again. And then also his health starts to deteriorate. Now, there's a lot of discussion about exactly what he was suffering from. He certainly seems to have been being treated for syphilis. Others have said, well, this could equally have been a tumour. But whatever it was, there is a clear deterioration in his mental and his physical health. And his last years are a really painful, slow decline. And that must have been incredibly difficult for Churchill to witness as a teenager. So that, I think, is something else that then drives him to take up his father's mantle and to sort of finish what he'd started, and also to some extent to try and rehabilitate his father through taking up some of the causes that he championed, and indeed by writing a 2-volume biography of his father, which is one of the first sort of serious history books that Churchill writes in the early Edwardian period. And it's quite clear that this was really important to him. There is a very interesting article called The Dream, which you may be aware of, which Churchill wrote just after the Second World War in about 1947, I think. And in The Dream, he pictures himself, or writes about himself, sitting in his painting studio at his house in Chartwell in Kent, where he is touching up, restoring a portrait of his father that has become damaged. And as he does this, in the article he describes how the ghost of his father appears to him, and they have a conversation. And in this conversation, Churchill's father asks about really what has happened since his death in 1895. And so Churchill talks him through the first half of the 20th century, the Bolshevik Revolution and the two terrible wars, the First World War and the Second World War. But then, really interestingly, before Churchill has had a chance to explain his role in those events, and particularly in the Second World War, the father's ghost disappears in a puff of cigarette smoke. Now, whether this was a real experience, I doubt it was. I suspect it's Churchill letting his feelings go in print. But it's an interesting article because it's one of the few things that he wrote that he never published. He wrote it and gave it to his children, and he didn't want it published in his lifetime. It was published afterwards, after his death. And the fact that the father disappears before he's had a chance to explain his role, I think, again, re-emphasises that, throughout his whole life, even after the Second World War, Churchill is still pursuing, to some extent, the approval of his father. And I can remember a conversation I had with Mary Soames, Winston's youngest daughter, and she recalled asking her father if he had any regrets in his life. And she expected him to say that his biggest regret was not winning the Military Cross or the Victoria Cross, because he always loved to be sort of surrounded by sort of brave military veterans. But interestingly, what he said was that he'd wished his father had lived long enough to see him make something of himself.
I just want to move on a little bit to, you said earlier that he grew up in quite a comfortable background, and obviously he was born in a palace, wasn't he? So how is it that Churchill had such a profound ability to connect with the common man in the street with his words when, he comes from such a background? Probably many people of that background didn't have that ability to just sort of transcend politics, and he maintained popularity, I think, in the public, even though he didn't have political allies a lot across party lines. So where did that come from, and how did he have that ability to connect with the average person? Again,
that's a really good question. And Of course, he doesn't always get it right. He doesn't always connect. There are moments in his career where he spectacularly misjudges the moment. A famous example of that would be speaking in favour of Edward VIII at the time of the abdication crisis, where he's very out of touch with the public mood. Or perhaps on his opposition to Indian independence in the 1930s, which is certainly again out of touch with mainstream political opinion. But I think, to come back to your main question, what makes him sort of such an effective, inspiring politician? It is that combination of sort of words and theatre again that I would come back to. Churchill, I think, realizes that to advance in politics, you've got to be noticed, and to be noticed, you have to be slightly different, he's someone who is already sort of quite eccentric in his sort of dress style, and I think he develops that quite deliberately. This is a man who very early on the press pick up on the fact that he likes to wear different hats. And so they start to present him in cartoons wearing all of these different hats, and that starts to sort of bring him to public notice. But he's very aware of his own image from quite early on. You've got the famous bow tie, the frock coat, the top hats early on, the Astrakhan coat, and then later on in the Second World War you have the famous siren suit, the zip-up suit. I often describe it as a sort of proto-onesie, which he could put on very easily in the event of bomb alarms. He would wear 10-gallon hats. He would flash his famous V for Victory salute. You've got the omnipresent cigar. So he's someone who is aware, I think, of the importance of image. He's aware of the sort of cameras around him. And he lives in an age, of course, where film is really just starting to take off. And he takes a very keen interest in it. He goes out to Hollywood in 1929, and he's entertained by William Randolph Hearst. He meets Charlie Chaplin. He visits the film studios, and thereafter he develops a friendship with Alexander Korda and takes a keen interest in Korda's films. So he's someone who's aware of the power of film, certainly by the time it comes to the Second World War, and he's able to use that and to utilise that as part of his war premiership to sort of project his image. So that's one part of it, certainly, and that certainly enables him to reach and connect with a wider audience. Another part of it, I think, is through the words, and he's certainly able to survive crises that might have finished another political career by writing about it, and by writing about these things, not just in books for the educated elite, but also as newspaper articles. So during the 1920s, 1930s, he's writing articles for many of the popular newspapers of the day, and he's writing on a whole range of subjects, not just political subjects, although he does, but also he writes articles on the latest scientific advances. He writes an article, Are There Men in the Moon? And this is, again, all a way of sort of raising his profile, connecting with a wider audience through words. I mean, he's interesting because he's not someone who has a strong party base. In fact, he's someone who changes political party twice, starting as a Conservative, switching to the Liberals, and then famously re-ratting back to the Conservatives. He doesn't spend an enormous amount of time trying to build political alliances and political groups within the House of Commons. He conducts his politics through his books, through his newspaper articles, through his speeches, and through great set-piece campaigns. Churchill's someone who likes to campaign on the big issues. Early on, it's his defence of free trade against tariff reform, then it becomes reform of the House of Lords, then it becomes anti-communism, then it's opposition to Indian independence, then it's opposing Chamberlain's policy of appeasement and calling for rearmament. And after the war, you have him sort of campaigning for greater European unity in the face of Stalin's domination of Eastern Europe. So he always has to have a set cause, and that cause, I think, allows him to raise his profile, allows him to sort of take the fight to the public audience. He has to have a cause and an enemy.
I can see there that where most politicians of that time would probably, their words would only echo within the House of Commons. He's taking it outside the House of Commons, and he's in a public forum, really. And that's probably where he's fighting on a different terrain in many ways. And that's probably where he can have more influence over the narrative and the discussion. I just wanted to ask really about his actions during the First World War, because people today see him as this great wartime leader, obviously, but he had a failure, didn't he, when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, with the Gallipoli campaign, wasn't it, at the Dardanelles? How did he learn from that experience? Because obviously much has been written about it. What does the personal correspondence and what does your own research of Churchill show about how he learned from that experience, and perhaps how he carried that on to his World War II leadership?
Okay. Well, I mean, the First World War for Churchill was a real roller coaster ride. He starts the war as First Lord of the Admiralty. So he's the British minister in charge of the Navy, the largest navy in the world. He's only 39 years old when the war starts, so he's still comparatively young. And up until this point, his career has been a sort of meteoric rise. And there's no doubt that, although he's horrified by the effects of war and the casualties of war, that he also sees the war as an opportunity to really make his name. But it all goes spectacularly wrong for him. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he's determined to find a way of using the Navy. The problem he's got is that, of course, the war descends very quickly into a trench stalemate in Europe, and there is very little for the Navy to do other than to sort of blockade Germany and to be ready in case the German fleet comes out to fight a major engagement. But during that first year of the war, it doesn't come out. So Churchill is desperately looking around for ways to use the Navy, and what he sort of fixes on is an opportunity at the Dardanelles Straits, the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. And his strategy there, or the strategy that he advocates in cabinet, is that if the British Navy can force the Dardanelles Straits, they can get into the Sea of Marmara, and then they can besiege Constantinople. And if they can successfully besiege Constantinople, they can knock Turkey out of the war, relieving pressure on Russia and creating a second front. It's a wonderfully grand strategic concept and sort of typically Churchillian in that respect. But the problem, of course, is that when it comes to trying to do that, they simply don't have the resources to force the Straits. They massively underestimate the strength of the Turkish resistance, and of course they can't spare the best ships for the campaign at the Dardanelles. So when the fleet assembled at the Dardanelles attempts to force the Straits, it fails. 3 battleships are sunk. At that point, really, the operation should have been abandoned. But rather than abandon it, Churchill and others choose in the War Cabinet to press on. And so they send a military force which then attempts to seize the Gallipoli Peninsula next to the Dardanelles.
To be clear on that, he was the sole architect of this, or was it the War Cabinet as a whole who were
No,
invested
I
in
mean,
this idea?
I think it's fair to say he's not the sole architect of this by any means, but he's undoubtedly the leading advocate in cabinet. And I think the problem with Churchill is that once he's fixed on a sort of great idea like this, he can get sort of swept up with it. And once it's started, it's very hard to put the genie back in the box. It's very hard to reverse direction. And it leads to these disastrous landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where the Allies take very heavy casualties. So it's British, French, Australian and New Zealand troops. And in the end, they're forced to evacuate. And the problem is that this leads to a huge breach between Churchill and Admiral Lord Fisher, who's the first Sea Lord, the senior admiral. And Fisher actually resigns, goes AWOL, which was a bizarre thing to do in wartime. And it leads Asquith, or it's one of the things that leads Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, to effectively forces him to restructure his government. He brings in the Conservatives. The price of Conservative inclusion in that administration is that Churchill be sacked as First Lord of the Admiralty, because the Conservatives haven't forgiven him for defecting to the Liberal Party, and he doesn't go back to the Conservatives until 1924. So Churchill suddenly finds himself out of office. He goes from being at the centre of things to really struggling to influence events. He takes up painting. He holds a sort of sinecure office as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, but he's becoming increasingly frustrated. And in the end, he resigns his position in Parliament, or resigns from the government. He remains an MP. He resigns from the government and he takes up his commission, and he goes and commands a battalion of Royal Scots Fusiliers on the Western Front in Belgium for a 6-month period, before then coming back to Parliament.
So he always had to be close to the action, essentially.
Yeah,
always.
Effectively. I mean, this is. I mean, it's quite a bold move. I mean, it's about sort of, I suppose, again, very visibly sort of rehabilitating yourself in the public sphere by taking up the commission. But he is also someone who did like to be at the centre of things, and if he couldn't influence things in Westminster, then it was better to try and do so at the front line. Of course, he was only a lieutenant colonel. I think he'd been hoping that he would have been made a much higher rank and would have been able to influence things more clearly. But he ends the war brought back by Lloyd George as Minister of Munitions in Lloyd George's administration. So he ends the war, actually responsible for developing armaments and supplying the Allies with armaments. In terms of what he learns from all of this, I think it's interesting. I think that the main lesson that Churchill takes from the Dardanelles, and that might not be the same thing as the lesson that other people would say he should have taken. But I think the main lesson that he takes is that if you're going to attempt a complex operation like that, which involves both the Navy and the Army, it involves forces from different countries, it involves very careful coordination between the civilian and military authorities. If you're going to do that, then you need to be in charge. And I think that does have a huge influence on him when he becomes wartime Prime Minister in 1940. Because one of the first things that he does is to insist that he become not just Prime Minister, but also Minister of Defence, which is a new position which he effectively creates. He's basically putting himself above the Secretary of State for War, the Secretary of State for Air, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, and saying that now this time round, the service chiefs are going to report in directly to me. So he's bypassing those departmental ministers. And what he's doing is creating an office within Downing Street at the heart of the Whitehall machine that melds the political and military authority into one. So as Prime Minister, he is head of the War Cabinet. He's got the Cabinet Secretary reporting into him. He has his own Downing Street team of private secretaries. He has his own private advisors. He's the first Prime Minister to have a scientific advisor effectively in the Oxford physicist Frederick Lindemann. And he's also got the Chiefs of Staff, and a staff as a military staff as Minister of Defence. So he creates this one unit to effectively to run major operations, and he makes it very clear that as Prime Minister, his priority is going to be international relations and military operations, and that's where he's going to put the focus. That's very clear. it also means, of course, that he can't escape the blame when things go wrong, because he is directly associating himself.
Well, it's accountability,
with,
isn't it?
with,
Really,
with the military, with the military effort. But that, I think, is the clear lesson that he takes from the First World War, or one of them. Another, I think, would be the need to avoid at all costs the sort of trench stalemate that you got in Europe between 1914 and 18. And I think that certainly influences the policy he adopts towards military operations. I think he's quite clear that it does not make any sense to go back into France, into northwestern Europe, until you can do so with overwhelming force and to know that you can win. And that until that point, the best strategy is to fight the enemy on as many fronts as possible, and to wear them down. So to wear Germany down in North Africa, in the Mediterranean theatre, but also through the strategic bombing campaign that's conducted in increasing volume from Britain, and to build up a sort of grand alliance against fascism to sort of contain and constrict Hitler until the moment where you can launch that sort of final blow.
Because I was actually going to ask how the words Churchill articulated about victory at all costs when he got into office, and the reality on the ground. Well, he took office on actually, I think it was nearly the day that the Nazi Germany launched an offensive. How could he be so confident in victory? Or was it kind of bluster? Or did he go in there with an overarching strategy of how he was going to do things? Or was it figured out as he went along?
Well, I think there's no doubt that Churchill was always going to fight if he could. I mean, we talk nowadays in terms of hawks and doves, and if you look at 1940, then Churchill was clearly the hawk, and Halifax, Foreign Secretary under Chamberlain and then initially under Churchill, was in many ways the dove. So Halifax was still hoping that they could find some diplomatic way out of this terrible crisis. Churchill believed very firmly that you had to fight. He didn't rule out, when he became Prime Minister, the possibility of some form or ultimately of negotiation with Hitler. But he felt that you had to do that from as strong a position as possible. And therefore, you didn't want to negotiate from a position of weakness. You wanted to fight and to try and negotiate from a position of strength if you had to. That was very much his position in 1940. So Churchill was always going to fight if he could. In terms of this question of, when he said those words about victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however hard and long the road may be, I think he did believe in ultimate victory, and that comes, I think, partly through his own reading of sort of British history and his own vision of British history, that Britain, and in a way, his you asked me about his own self-belief and his sense of destiny. That's sort of an extension of his vision of Britain itself and how this country has this unique destiny. It's that sort of Whig history where there's been this sort of progress of the country. I think it was driven by that sort of that historical perspective by in part, but it was also, of course, driven by his knowledge that we were not alone. There is this myth about 1940 that Britain was standing alone. It's simply not true. We were certainly on the front line, and we certainly hadn't expected to be on the front line. We'd expected that the war was going to play out like the First World War in Europe, and that actually the German army was going to be fighting the large French army with the British Expeditionary Force, the British Navy and the British RAF in support, and that's where the main campaign would take place. That was the plan. It's the sudden fall of France that changes everything. And suddenly Britain finds itself on the front line and faced with the prospect of direct attack. And that's what prompts this huge crisis in May, June 1940, and it's what prompts the debates about whether we should fight on. But Churchill knows, of course, that we may suddenly be on the front line, but we're not alone. He is someone who had a lifelong belief in the British Empire. He'd served as a young soldier of the British Empire. He'd served as Under Secretary of State and then later as Secretary of State for the colonies. So he has I think a knowledge of the empire and a belief that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, that these forces will come to our aid and our support. He also is much more pro-American than many of his colleagues. As Minister of Munitions at the end of the First World War, he'd seen the difference that America had made and would have been able to make had the war gone on. Coming into that conflict, he developed sort of relationships with leading American politicians and industrialists, and I think he saw the potential of America. He was, after all, half American by birth. He'd visited America on many occasions, so I think he sees in America sort of great potential, even though it's going to take time to mobilise that. And he has a great belief that America will do the right thing. I mean, that belief is sorely tested by events in 1940 and 41. But I think all of that plays into that determination and confidence in 1940.
I was going to say, just picking up on something you said there, it seems as if Churchill's advantage in many ways was applying history to the problem. He applied history to the problem. He saw Adolf Hitler in the context of the long continuum of British history. Would you agree with that? Would you say that he's had a massive advantage by having studied history and been so well learned at that?
Yeah, I think history helps him enormously when it comes to sort of thinking about how you contain a European dictator, for example, because of course he'd studied the campaigns of his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. He was interestingly a great admirer of Napoleon, which often surprises people, but he'd spent a lot of time studying Napoleon's career, both as a politician and as a soldier, and that all helps to a certain extent. But of course, history can also lead you in the wrong direction. So I don't think, for example, that he gets everything right about the Second World War. I think you can argue that in terms of the sort of the grand strategic picture, that Britain can weather this, that Britain can fight, it can draw on these resources of empire, that it can draw on the increasing relationship with the United States. That's all helpful. But he fails to appreciate, I think, some of the changes that have occurred in modern warfare. So I think, like so many others, he's caught out by the French collapse in 1940. He doesn't predict it. He expects the Maginot Line to sort of hold back the Germans. He doesn't foresee these new tactics that the Germans are able to use, where they have the combination of very mobile heavy armour supported by dive bombers, and how that changes the dynamic and allows them simply to sort of to smash through these static lines. Similarly, he still, I think, tends to think in terms of warfare at sea being conducted by great ships in major engagements, and fails to appreciate the full enormity, perhaps, of the U-boat threat, but also of the danger to ships, particularly capital ships, now provided by air power. So, for example, the Japanese in December 1941, where they sink the Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, which Churchill has deliberately sent out to sort of to cow the Japanese, but he sent them out without air protection, and that then leads very rapidly to their sinking. So he doesn't history can give you certain perspectives, but it can also lead you not to see some of the, not perhaps to appreciate all of the changes that are taking place.
Mm-hmm. How did Churchill make decisions during that war period when he's under such immense pressure? I understand that as you said earlier, he thrives in a crisis. He seems to live for that, but at the same time, you have limited information, even in the best of times, particularly when there's an ongoing war going on. So how did he what was his process of making decisions? How much did he lean on his advisors, for example?
Yeah, so I think Churchill, he certainly has an ability to compartmentalize, which you clearly need, because basically, during the Second World War, you're just being hit by one thing after another, and it's interesting that most of the time he was clearly able to sleep very well and very soundly. He would sometimes even take a nap during the day in order to sort of recharge his batteries, and I think that is clearly important in facilitating his decision making. He was also very focused. He had a gift of latching on to what was the most important issue at any one moment, and then focusing exclusively on that. It's something that comes out in the memoirs of a number of the people who served very closely with him. They all identify that he had this sort of ability to pick the main issue and then focus on that at that time, to the exclusion of all else. So I think focus is clearly important. In terms of how he made his decisions, I think he normally has an instinct that he would follow first of all, and then he would raise that in with the chiefs of staff, with the relevant politicians, with the war cabinet. So basically, he would effectively make his case and say this is what I think, and then he would effectively challenge people to shoot that down. And I think if you were able to argue strongly enough, and if, for example, all of the chiefs of staff agreed that what he was proposing was rubbish, or if Anthony Eden, as Foreign Secretary, held his ground and was joined by some of his political colleagues in opposing something Churchill was suggesting, then he would normally back down. I think the interesting thing is he was, certainly during the war, more consensual in his style of government than he is often portrayed in the public media. I mean, in public, you've got this very strong image, which he's deliberately cultivating, of this cigar-chomping, scowling bulldog warrior. But behind the scenes, he's someone who already has a lot of political experience by the time he becomes Prime Minister. He knows how the systems work. He also knows that he is leading a coalition government in wartime, and that therefore he needs the support of Parliament, and that he needs the support of the other major political figures. And actually he does ensure that the main issues are fully debated. The military issues are debated with the chiefs of staff on an almost daily basis. He quite often drives Alan Brooke, his chief of Imperial General Staff, mad by repeatedly returning to ideas that Alan Brooke thinks are mad, like an invasion of Norway. He also ensures that all the big issues are brought to the War Cabinet and debated in the War Cabinet. But of course, he controls the agenda. And he can control the way that process is conducted. He chooses exactly what is debated when and with whom. And he also has a very good machine within Downing Street to supply him with as much information as possible before he takes things to discussion with others. So he has his own map room, he has his own statistical unit which is assembling information for him. He's able to run ideas past Lord Charwell, his scientific advisor, or people like Desmond Morton, who's his interface with the intelligence services. clearly has an inner circle that he debates these things with before then taking them to other fora. But I think my main point is that actually he is accountable to the War Cabinet, and is also accountable to Parliament, and those things that he takes very seriously. So you will see him throughout the war repeatedly going back to Parliament to take questions. He even takes part in a couple of confidence motions, which his government wins very easily. But the very fact that you can have those sorts of debates and motions in wartime shows that he's not, although he rails against opposition and sort of at various times attacks the press or attacks people like Anurin Bevin and Harold Lasky in the Labour Party, he is actually allowing quite a lot of debate to take place.
That is really interesting, because that's where I think that there perhaps is a gulf between the public perception that seeped into popular consciousness about Churchill during war, this sort of British bulldog fighting on all fronts, which is certainly true, but he's far more conciliatory, therefore, in his decision-making than you would expect. I wanted to also ask about kind of world leaders and his relationship with world leaders. One which I'm particularly fascinated with is his relationship with Joseph Stalin. Mm-hmm. And I did read this story about him going to his dacha in Moscow and getting extremely intoxicated with Stalin. Is that true? And then there was some decision-making that was taking place there as well?
It is true, and it relates to the very first meeting between Churchill and Stalin, which is in 1942, August 1942. And Churchill flies over to Moscow effectively to tell Stalin that there won't be a second front in France in 1942, and that he's going to have to wait at least till 1943. And in the end, of course, it's 1944. So this isn't news that Stalin wants to hear. So, and I think Churchill describes it as like taking like taking a lump of ice to the North Pole, taking this news to Stalin. So they go over, and the way Stalin handles Churchill at this meeting, I think, is very interesting. So they have a very cordial first meeting, which I think leads to the British Party relaxing. And perhaps sort of relaxing too much, because at the next meeting, the next day, Stalin launches into an attack on the British and American allies, basically accusing them of not being prepared to fight the Germans, of being cowards, and so on. And of course, this makes Churchill sort of incredibly angry. And by the end of this meeting, he's almost prepared to sort of walk away and just take the aeroplane and fly out, which of course would have been disastrous to the alliance with the Soviet Union. And news of that presumably gets back to Stalin, probably because he's bugging some of the rooms. And so an invitation comes to Churchill to join Stalin in his private apartment, where they go and they eat this feast. I think it's just the two of them, served by Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. And Churchill later describes how he watched as Stalin devoured a whole suckling pig, I think. But they have this huge feast, they drink an awful lot, and they come to a sort of personal accommodation. And this clearly has a huge influence on Churchill. I think he believes that he's been able to establish a personal rapport, a personal relationship with Stalin. And it's just, I think the reality is that this was just a continuation of the way in which Stalin was sort of playing him at this time. It's very interesting that one of the problems that Churchill and Roosevelt and later Truman have is that they don't really understand what's going on in Russia. They've got no way of understanding how the Kremlin really works. And so they're not really sure how much power Stalin has, or actually whether there are shadowy forces within the Politburo behind him that are actually controlling events. And this, I think, then affects the way that they interpret communications that come from the Soviet Union during the war, because Stalin, I think deliberately to keep Churchill and Roosevelt off balance, often sends very conflicting, very contradictory signals. One moment you'll have a very friendly telegram saying how well the Allies are doing in Sicily or whatever, and then the next you'll have an extremely cross telegram demanding a second front now, saying we need more supplies and so on. And I think both Churchill and Roosevelt struggle with this, and they put it down to the fact, I think, that Stalin may not be in overall control, and that there are other people behind the scenes who are actually dictating the Russian strategy. And of course, as we now know, with the benefit of hindsight, that is completely wrong. Stalin was in sole charge, and I think as a result, it causes them to some extent to underestimate Stalin, and I think it is an interesting relationship, because on the one hand, Churchill is a diehard anti-communist. He's someone who, from the moment of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, is clear that the Soviet Union is an enemy, and during the 1920s he sees the hand of Moscow everywhere, behind the sort of the fall of empires, behind the general strike in the UK, and so on, and very vociferous anti-communist. And yet, of course, in the 1930s, interestingly, he makes the leap to recognising that actually Hitler is a bigger threat in the immediate term to the stability of Europe. And in 1941, when Hitler attacks the Soviet Union, he famously declares that if Hitler had invaded hell, I would have at least made a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. And that's very much his attitude to Stalin. In his speech at that time, he says he's not going to unsay any word that he said against communism, but that if the Russian people are now fighting Hitler, then it falls on us to give them any support that we can. So you've got that sort of doublethink built into the relationship from the beginning, and it then, I think, becomes even further complicated by this strange, complex relationship with Stalin, where I think he assumes he's established a personal relationship that perhaps isn't there. I think Churchill believed in Realpolitik. He believed in sort of great men, and his view, of course, it would have been men meeting face to face to discuss these issues, and he believed in his own power as a negotiator and his ability to influence these things. But I think he probably underestimates Stalin.
I was going to say, actually, on that point, that do you think perhaps he was too trusting of Stalin towards the end? Because obviously we saw the way the sort of Soviet grips of power gripped Eastern Europe and prevented free elections in Poland and across much of Eastern Europe, and he at that time was still calling him Uncle Joe and all of that, and perhaps maybe too much trusting, and he couldn't see beyond the horizon. Although on the other hand, he did sound the alarm on the Iron Curtain earlier than most.
Well, you can see him starting to struggle with this really from the Tehran conference at the end of 1943 onwards. And you can see the problem getting worse as the Red Armies start to move across Eastern Europe. I think Churchill clings to the hope that if he can meet with Stalin face to face, then they can resolve many of these issues. Hence the percentages agreement in October 1944, when they do meet, and Churchill suggests carving the Balkans up into spheres of influence between the Soviet Union and Britain, so that Britain has 90% influence in Greece, and the Soviet Union will have the same in some of the other Balkan states. So I think he sort of clings to that belief, but you can see him realising that Russia is going to become a dominant force in southern and eastern Europe and in the Balkans, and that is a threat to Churchill's worldview. What Churchill is fighting for is a restoration of the British Empire as it was in 1939. So you can see, that there are potential areas of conflict developing now in the Mediterranean, and so you in public, Churchill, of course, has to be positive about Stalin and about the Soviet Union. And of course, as far as the British public are concerned, the Soviet Union has been bearing the brunt of these German offensives on the Eastern Front, and is our ally. So he has to be very careful about how he criticises the Soviet Union in public. Also, Roosevelt, of course, is thinking ahead and is thinking towards setting up the United Nations, and is very clear that he wants the Soviet Union to be part of that United Nations and to be on the Security Council. Therefore, he doesn't want, the Americans don't want to breach with the Soviet Union at this point. So in public, Churchill is having to be very careful in terms of what he says. In private, you can see him getting increasingly worried by the Soviet advances, and also by what that may mean for countries like Poland. And of course, Britain had nominally gone to war for Poland in 1939. So in his telegrams behind the scenes with Roosevelt and then Truman, or with Eden, you do see him starting to use terms like Iron Curtain, and even to talk about the possibility of a Third World War. And before he steps down as Prime Minister, one of his last acts is to actually get the British Chiefs of Staff to come up with a plan for a limited war between Britain and the Soviet Union in Europe, to stop Soviet expansionism. They called it Operation Unthinkable. And of course it was completely unthinkable, and the conclusion of the planning was that there was no way that Britain could seek to oppose the Red Army in Europe without it escalating into a sort of full-blown global war, and that this was completely impossible without the support of the Americans and British public opinion. So it goes nowhere. It does prove unthinkable. But I think it is interesting that on the one hand, Churchill is very aware of the dangers. On the other hand, I think he has to cling to that personal belief that if he can get to Stalin himself, that somehow they can talk these things out.
I see. I mean, that's really, really interesting, the ups and downs in that sort of relationship. I was going to really ask you something now personal. Obviously, you've read all the correspondence, as much correspondence as you can, from Churchill. He's probably the most quoted and misquoted as well person in this sort of domain. What is a piece of advice or something he's written that's really had an impact on your life?
Now, that's a really interesting question, and quite a difficult one to answer in a lot of ways. I would say that the main thing for me would just be it's his ability to keep going. I think I know this. I mean, I know other people will have said this, but it's the ability to survive setbacks that would have finished other people's careers, and it's how he does that. I think, and I think he does it for an interesting combination of words and actions. But this ability to continue to look forward, I think, which is interesting. I mean, Churchill is full of paradoxes. In many ways, he's a Victorian conservative, an imperialist. Many of his views are very, very old-fashioned, outdated today. And yet he somehow combines that with this interest in science and technology. And this... He keeps a faith in progress, which is something which I think is being sorely tested as we look around the world today. And I suppose the thing that I would take from it is if we're serious about solving the problems that we face today, the huge problems associated with climate change, for example, then we need to be able to sort of to focus and mobilize in the way that he did to do that. It's to bring that sort of single-minded focus, and also to have belief, the belief that we can do it, but also the ability to apply the science and technology to that. And one of the interesting things about Churchill, I think, is that he did use his office quite successfully to convene people, to bring people together. He spent an enormous amount of time during the Second World War bringing experts together to consider conferences on bombing or on, how the problem of how you storm an enemy-held beach, which led to the development of artificial harbours, special tanks, all of these sort of things. And he would bring together a range of politicians, military leaders, scientific experts to debate these issues. And on the international sphere, it's Churchill who really made the running to conduct the Grand Alliance against fascism. It's Churchill that does all the shuttling between Stalin and Roosevelt. So I think what we really need is that sort of convening power and focus.
I see, and it's quite it's another difficult question here, and it's obviously quite personal to you. But if you had the opportunity to sit down with Churchill, what do you think you'd want to know in retrospect? What would you want to ask him?
Ooh. Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I imagine that if I did sit down with Winston Churchill, that it would probably be more or less a one-way conversation, and it would be much less about what I was going to ask him as to what he wanted from me and to get out of me. I think he would have been both an exhilarating and an exasperating person to be around. I suppose, yeah, it is. I mean, at the end of his life, there are various quotes, quite well documented, attributed to him, to saying that, he'd achieved so much at the end to achieve nothing at all. And I think I would want to know really, what he meant by that at the end of his life, because as you said, he's one of the most famous people in the world. He was during his lifetime. He remains an incredibly high profile presence in the world today, one of the most quoted and misquoted people, one of the most controversial people in many ways. And yet the fact that at the end he felt that perhaps he hadn't made a difference, I think I'd want to explore that. What did he mean by that? Was it just that the world of his youth had disappeared, or was it something more?
I did read somewhere that he did, in the same way you have, that he did perceive his life as a failure in a sense. And I think a large part of that probably was the loss of or decline of the British Empire, which he felt really affectionately about. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, it's that idea of, is it that he was just, I mean, he's become almost a personification of Britain, hasn't he? And in the way he was portrayed in cartoons as being this sort of John Bull figure. But is that how he saw himself? I suppose that's the nub of that question. Or actually, did he feel he'd failed in other ways? And if so, what were they?
I guess one of the final question I have for you is, apart from Winston Churchill, and it's something I want to ask a lot of people who I'm going to talk to on this podcast as well, which other historical leader would you most like to sit down with and talk with from history, if anybody?
I think the problem is there are so many, and lots of people that I would love to talk to. I mean, in terms of sort of more recent history, and I'm sure other people will say the same thing. And it would be incredible to hear from Nelson Mandela, for example, and to know, how he kept going through that sort of long. I mean, we talk about Churchill's wilderness years, but Nelson Mandela spent so long in prison, and then to come back and to be able to respond in a positive way, which encouraged reconciliation rather than conflict. I mean, I think it is an amazing achievement, and I think it would be really interesting to talk to him. But there are lots of sort of figures now who sort of are largely forgotten in history, or are being forgotten, and I think it would be good to go back and to revisit some of them. I think, to go back and to talk to David Lloyd George, for example, about the First World War would be incredibly interesting. Or and then, of course, I could put back on my medieval historian hat, in which case I need to go back a lot further. But I think the point is that it's one of the great things for me about archives is that they plunge you back into the moment. They let you see events unfold in real time, but they also give you an insight into people's thinking and people's characters, and that's why I really love what I do. And I think it's not just the sort of the great figures. Actually, history is made and events are made by a wealth of different individuals interacting together. And what would be really fantastic, actually, would be to stay, to bring back not just Churchill, but to put him alongside Stalin and Roosevelt, and let them debate, where it all went right and wrong at the end of the Second World War, and to be a fly on the wall of that conversation. But it's not just the great figures. There are also all of the individuals who contributed in small ways to what happens. I mean, I'm working on D-Day at the moment. The people who built the artificial harbours, the people who designed the special tanks, the people who came up with the deception plans which fooled the Germans. There are just too many good conversations to have.
As an archivist, I was really interested to know your thoughts on the sort of sobering impact of war, because obviously you've authored How Churchill Waged War. Do you feel that, because that generation of leaders which Churchill was a part of, whether it was Konrad Adenauer or Roosevelt and Truman, and they had known war, they'd been familiar with it, they'd seen it in their lifetime. Do you think there's something to be said for the fact that it's a limiting factor that our current crop of world leaders haven't seen it in the same way?
Yes, it probably. I mean, you wouldn't wish it on them, though, would you? And you wouldn't wish it on all of us. This is the thing. But yeah, I mean, the Second World War was such a huge moment of national and international crisis that, of course, in the aftermath, it leads to a huge amount of dislocation, and then you have to repair that. So you have to put in place some form of international system to try and stop this happening again. And so that generation were involved in constructing those structures, whether that's the United Nations, NATO, Europe. And the problem is, of course, that as the initial crisis, the initial catalyst for those things recedes out of living memory, their relevance becomes less obvious to the current generation, perhaps. And I suppose they also become slightly outdated. I mean, I'm not arguing these things shouldn't be revisited and looked at and updated and all this, but I think that that generation had a very clear motivation for constructing a new international framework. And it seems to me that framework is now frayed around the edges and falling apart. And probably what we need is a new framework. But we haven't yet clearly reached the point of crisis, which is actually compelling people to do that, which is a shame.
That's really fascinating. I think that it is receding memory, really, war in that instance. Having experiencing and living through a world war, the kind of, not even a compulsion, but the drive to make sure that it never happened again, build a consortium of nations, was very palpable and profound at that stage. But yeah, thank you so much, Alan. Really, really grateful. I really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me.